January 17, 1991. KARI Air Defense Sector Operations Center, Baghdad. Ambiance: the hum of high-voltage cathode tubes and the stale smoke of dozens of cigarettes. The air inside the bunker was recycled cold and smelled faintly of ozone and confident sweat. This was the KARI system, a reversed French acronym for Iraq, but the heart beating beneath the concrete floor was pure Soviet iron. For decades, the philosophy of the Eastern Bloc had been absolute and unwavering. You do not defeat the enemy with finesse, you defeat him with density. Quantity has a quality all its own. To the Iraqi commanders and their Soviet technical advisors, the sky above Baghdad was not empty space. It was a kill box. It was the most heavily defended airspace in the history of warfare, denser than Hanoi, deadlier than the Golan Heights. They had constructed a mathematical impossibility for any intruder. A layered cake of death consisting of long-range SA-2 guidelines, low-altitude SA-3 GOAS, and the mobile, terrifying SA-6 Gainfuls. The radar scopes swept in hypnotic, rhythmic circles, green lines tracing the empty dark. The general in charge leaned back, watching the P-15 flat-face radar displays. He was not afraid of the United States Air Force. He respected their engines, perhaps, but he laughed at their philosophy. The Americans were obsessed with complexity, with fragile electronics that would fry in the desert heat. They built Ferraris to fight in a mud pit. The Soviet doctrine adopted here was the sledgehammer. If the Americans flew low, the anti-aircraft artillery, 3,000 barrels of it, would shred them. If they flew high, the missiles would catch them. Let them come. We can see a bird at 50 kilometers. We can see the rain. A 20-ton jet cannot hide. This was the paper tiger theory in its purest form. The East believed that Western technology was a decadent crutch, a way to avoid the hard reality of war. They believed in the immutable laws of physics. Radar works on a simple, brutal principle: reflection. You send out a pulse of electromagnetic energy. It hits an object. It bounces back. The larger the object, the louder the echo. A fighter jet is a flying mirror. There is no magic spell to stop a mirror from reflecting light. The operators watched their screens with the smug satisfaction of men protected by a wall of science. They had run the simulations. They knew the cross-section of an F-15, an F-16, even the massive B-52. Every incoming threat was a known variable with a corresponding solution. They were ready for a fight. They were ready for noise. They were ready for the sky to light up with the chaotic scream of jamming pods and afterburners. They were waiting for a war they could understand. But outside, in the crushing blackness of the moonless desert sky, the variables had changed. The logic of the sledgehammer was about to collide with a ghost. The radar waves from the ground were indeed shooting up into the night, searching, screaming at the speed of light for something to touch. But nothing was bouncing back. The general checked his watch. The deadline had passed. The Americans were late, he thought. Or perhaps they were too scared to enter the meat grinder. He looked at the scope again. It was perfectly clear. Silence. Static. Green emptiness. He did not know that the first bomb had already left the bay. He did not know that directly above his head, a geometry that defied God and aerodynamics was sliding through the electromagnetic spectrum like a razor blade through water. Altitude, 15,000 feet. Speed, subsonic. Signature, 0.00. The sky was not empty. It was occupied by a machine that resembled a shard of obsidian chiseled by a paranoid mathematician. The F-117 Nighthawk did not fly, it haunted the airspace. Inside the cockpit, the pilot was not wrestling with the stick like a dogfighter. He was typing. He was a systems administrator for a flying computer, staring at a grainy green and black monochrome display. The downward-looking infrared, or DLIR sensor, is the predator's eye. Unlike radar, which shouts to see, the DLIR is passive. It drinks in heat, the cold concrete of the bunker, the warm vents of the air conditioning, the heat plume of a generator. It sees the thermal ghost of the target without emitting a single photon of warning. On the ground, the Soviet-made early warning radars continued their rhythmic, desperate sweep. The massive antennae of the Spoon Rest and Tall King systems rotated mechanistically, bathing the sky in electromagnetic waves. These waves washed over the Nighthawk, but instead of bouncing back to the receiver, they were scattered, deflected, absorbed. The waves hit the faceted panels and skidded off into the infinite blackness of space. The radar screamed. The sky refused to answer. Target acquired. Laser on. A single GBU-27 Paveway 3, a 2,000-pound hammer with a laser-seeking brain detached from the internal bay. The bay doors snapped shut instantly to restore the stealth profile. For the Iraqi operators in the Sector Operations Center, the world was normal. The coffee was warm. The screens were clear. The air defense network was fully operational, a sleeping giant waiting for a nudge. Then the roof ceased to exist. The impact was not a noise, it was a physical overpressure that liquefied organs before the sound could register. The bunker did not just explode, it was disassembled. The piercing rod of the GBU-27 punched through feet of reinforced concrete, the pride of Soviet civil engineering, and detonated inside the nervous system of the facility. Black smoke, red emergency lights, the smell of burning copper and pulverized drywall. In the backup control centers across the city, panic was instantaneous and total. The network had just lost a node, a major node. But there was no data, no incoming track, no altitude reading, no speed vector. The operators stared at their scopes, frantic. "Status! Give me a status! Who fired?" "Where are they?" "There is nothing on the scope, Colonel. The sky is clear." This was the anomaly, the moment the worldview fractured. In a conventional war, you see the enemy. You track the incoming flight of bombers, you scramble MiGs, you turn on the fire control radars. But here, buildings were erupting into pillars of flame, and the sensors were reporting a peaceful night. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. The Soviet doctrine relied on reaction. Action, then reaction. But how do you react to a void? Panic requires a direction. They had none. Desperation took over. If they could not see the target, they would kill the sky itself. The order went out. "Barrage fire!" The night turned into day. Baghdad erupted. 3,000 anti-aircraft guns opened up simultaneously. It was the greatest display of pyrotechnics in the history of modern warfare. The ZSU-23-4 Shilkas quad-barreled beasts spitting 4,000 rounds a minute wove nets of lead. The heavier 57mm cannons thumped rhythmically, filling the air with flak clouds. It was a wall of steel, a desperate attempt to fill every cubic inch of airspace with death. This is the golden BB theory. If you cannot aim, you saturate. You rely on probability. You assume that if you throw enough metal into the air, the enemy jet must eventually fly into it. It is the strategy of the blind man swinging a scythe in a crowded room. From the ground, it looked terrifying, a dome of tracers glowing red and yellow arcing over the city like a lethal cathedral. To the civilians on the ground and to the CNN reporters watching from the hotel balconies, it seemed impossible that anything could survive up there. It looked like the wrath of God. But up in the cockpit of the Nighthawk, the pilot looked down at the light show with a detached, almost bored curiosity. He was flying above the effective ceiling of the small guns and weaving between the predicted flight paths of the large ones. He was watching the Iraqis fight a war against a phantom. They were shooting at the sound of jet engines that had already passed. They were shooting at shadows. They were shooting at their own fear. Inside the surviving radar trucks, the operators were weeping. They were rebooting their systems. They were checking the cables. They were screaming at the maintenance crews.
The magnetron is working. The receiver is working. Why can't I see him?
The general who had laughed an hour ago was now staring at a blank screen while the ground shook beneath his feet. He watched the green sweep of the radar line round and round, monotonous, mocking. Every time the line passed over the sector where a building had just exploded, it showed nothing. No blip, no fuzz. Just clean, empty air. He began to realize that the Americans had not just brought a new plane. They had not just brought a better jammer. They had brought a rewrite of the laws of physics. The radar was not broken. The radar was obsolete. The massive investment in Soviet iron, the billions of dollars, the thousands of technicians, the years of training had been rendered instantly worthless by a shape. The blindness was not a malfunction. It was the new reality. The incident was complete. The system had failed. The arrogant Titan was now the blinded Cyclops, flailing in the dark, screaming, while the wizard calmly selected the next target from a drop-down menu 5 miles above the chaos. Location: Iraqi Intelligence HQ, Mukhabarat, Baghdad. Time: 400 hours. Object: shattered fragments of a concrete roof. In the smoke-filled briefing rooms of Baghdad and in the secure lines reaching back to Moscow, the investigation began. The theories flew as fast as the panic. The Soviet advisors were adamant. They looked at the data, or the lack of it, and they applied the logic of the Cold War. It is electronic warfare. They have a jammer we have never seen, a super jammer. They are blinding the receivers with noise. Others argued it was a plasma cloak, a sci-fi concept where ionized gas absorbed the waves. Still others believed the Americans were flying so low, literally skimming the sand dunes, that they were lost in the ground clutter. They were looking for a gadget, a device, a switch that the pilot flipped to turn invisible. They were looking for something active. They were wrong. The secret was not a machine, it was a shape. To understand why the KARI network failed, we have to leave the burning sands of Iraq and travel back in time. Not to an American lab, but to a Soviet one. The greatest irony of the Cold War is that the key to destroying the Soviet Union's air defense was forged in Moscow 25 years earlier by a man the Soviet military ignored. Name: Pyotr Ufimtsev. Title: Soviet Chief Scientist. Doctor: Method of edge waves in the physical theory of diffraction. Pyotr Ufimtsev was a brilliant mathematician, a man who saw the world in equations rather than steel. In 1962, he published a paper that solved a problem considered impossible, predicting how electromagnetic waves bounce off two-dimensional shapes. Before Ufimtsev, calculating the radar return of a complex object was like trying to predict the splash pattern of a boulder thrown into a lake. It was chaos. But Ufimtsev realized that if you broke the object down, the radar return was not determined by the size of the object, but by the configuration of its edges. If you angled a surface correctly, the radar wave would not bounce back to the source. It would bounce away, like a billiard ball hitting a bank shot. The Soviet military reviewed Ufimtsev's work. They looked at the math. It was sound. But then they looked at the implications. To make an aircraft invisible using these rules, it could not be shaped like an aircraft. It could not have curves. It could not have smooth blends. It would have to be a jagged, faceted nightmare. It would be aerodynamically unstable. It would be a brick. "This is useless," they said. "It will never fly." Because they believed it had no military value, the Soviet censors allowed the paper to be published openly. It was translated into English, and it sat gathering dust in technical libraries across the world, a hidden gem waiting for a jeweler. Location: Lockheed Skunk Works, Burbank, California. The Wizard, Dennis Overholzer. Atmosphere: tobacco smoke and secret genius. Enter the Wizard. Dennis Overholzer was a radar mathematician at Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works division. He was a man who did not care about aerodynamics. He cared about electromagnetics. When he found Ufimtsev's translated paper, he did not see a brick. He saw the Rosetta Stone. The shape is everything. If you change the shape, you change the game. Oberholzer wrote a computer program called Echo 1. At the time, computers were primitive. They did not have the processing power to calculate the radar reflection of a curved surface. The math was too heavy. But they could calculate flat triangles. So Oberholzer designed a plane made entirely of flat plates, no curves, no cylinders, just thousands of triangles welded together. He showed the design to Ben Rich, the head of Skunk Works. Rich looked at the drawing. It looked like a crushed beetle. It looked like something a child had folded out of bad origami. Dennis Rich said, "This is a hopeless diamond." But when they ran the numbers through Echo 1, the result was terrifying. A B-52 bomber has the radar cross-section of a barn door. An F-15 has the cross-section of a billboard. The hopeless diamond had the cross-section of a ball bearing. This was the technological chasm. The Soviets were building better radars to see smaller barns. The Americans decided to stop building barns and start building marbles. But the reveal is not just about the shape. It is about the massive engineering effort required to force that shape into the sky. The F-117 is aerodynamically unstable in all three axes. It wants to flip over. It wants to tumble. It defies the Bernoulli principle. In a conventional aircraft, if you let go of the stick, the plane levels out. If you let go of the stick in an F-117, the plane breaks apart. This was the second half of the miracle. To fly the Diamond, the engineers had to replace the pilot's muscles with silicon. They cannibalized the fly-by-wire system from the F-16. 4 computers voting constantly on the position of the control surfaces. The pilot does not fly the plane. The pilot asks the computer to fly the plane, and the computer makes thousands of micro-adjustments per second to keep the brick in the air. The Tech-Noir interface. Analog hydraulics met digital code. The engineering team went further. They had to erase every other signature. The engines were buried deep inside the fuselage. The air intakes were covered with grids that were smaller than the wavelength of enemy radar. A Faraday cage that allowed air in but kept radar waves out. The exhaust was flattened into wide platypus slits to mix the hot jet wash with cool air, killing the heat signature that heat-seeking missiles hunted. And finally, the skin. They coated the aluminum skeleton in sheets of RAM radar-absorbent material, a classified toxic black putty loaded with ferromagnetic particles. When a radar wave hits a metal plate, it bounces. When a radar wave hits RAM, it is trapped. The magnetic particles vibrate, converting the electromagnetic energy of the radar wave into tiny amounts of heat. The plane literally eats the radar pulse. The result was a machine that existed in a different dimension of warfare. It was slow. It could not turn tight circles. It had no gun. It had no afterburner. By 1950 standards, it was a piece of junk. But by 1990 standards, it was a predator. The Soviets had spent billions on the umbrella, the assumption that they could always build a more powerful radar to punch through the noise. They built bigger transmitters. They built taller towers. They fell into the megawatt trap. They believed that power was the answer. They were shouting into a void, expecting an echo. Back in the bunker in Baghdad, the general was still looking for a glitch. He was shouting at his technicians to check the fuses. He was operating on the assumption that the enemy was playing by the rules of aerodynamics. He did not know that the enemy had used a Soviet textbook to build a flying hole in the sky. The investigation was doomed to fail because the Iraqi and Soviet minds were looking for a better plane. They were looking for something faster, higher, stronger. They were not looking for a flying computer algorithm that rejected the very concept of visibility. The reality. Speed, Mach 0.92. RCS, 0.001 square meters. Status, invisible. While the Iraqis rebooted their systems, the wizards at Skunk Works were vindicated. The math held. The flat plates worked. The ghost was real. And as the Nighthawk banked silently over the next target, the pilot was not winning because he was a better aviator. He was winning because he was protected by a shield of pure mathematics that his enemy had discovered, discarded, and forgotten. Altitude, 12,000 feet. Airspeed, 450 knots. Cockpit pressure, stable. External environment, saturation fire. The pilot of the F-117 callsign Bandit was effectively strapped into a coffin of radar-absorbent material. The cockpit was cramped, angled, and claustrophobic. The glass of the canopy was not glass at all. It was a composite sandwich coated in a microscopic layer of gold, indium, and tin. This conductive coating is essential. Without it, the pilot's own helmet or the shape of his skull would reflect radar energy. The gold layer makes the canopy electrically continuous with the fuselage, ensuring the radar waves flow over the glass like water over a sealed hatch, blinding the enemy to the human inside. Through this gold-tinted window, the pilot watched the city of Baghdad burning. It was a surreal, horrific beauty. The ground below was a carpet of strobing lights, the muzzle flashes of thousands of anti-aircraft guns. The sky was laced with the lazy, arcing tracers of 23mm and 37mm cannons rising like fiery cobwebs. It looked like a thunderstorm trapped inside a bottle. Any other aircraft in the U.S. inventory would be screaming right now. An F-16 would be pulling 9 Gs, dumping flares, its radar warning receivers screeching the tone of a missile lock. But inside the Nighthawk, it was quiet. The silence was heavy. There was no RWR screaming because there was no lock. The pilot was not dogfighting. He was commuting through hell. He was the only calm man in a city of 4 million screaming souls. Ground level, outside the Al Rashid Hotel. Sound, the tearing of canvas, 23mm cannon fire. Smell, cordite and sewage. Down below, the Iraqi gunners were working in a frenzy of analog fury. Ahmed, a loader on a ZSU-23-4 Shilka, was sweating through his uniform. The Shilka is a terrifying weapon, a 4-barreled autonomous tank that spews explosive rounds at a rate that can saw an airplane in half. Ahmed's commander was screaming into the headset, staring at the RPK-2 Tobal radar scope. The Shilka was designed to hunt low-flying attack aircraft. Its radar was a masterpiece of Soviet engineering, capable of tracking a target moving at Mach 1 and calculating the lead angle instantly. But tonight, the Tobal was hallucinating. "I have ghosts! I have clutter! Where is the target?" The radar screen was awash with noise. The F-117s were not invisible in the magical sense, they were just quiet. Occasionally, a glint of radar energy might bounce off a bomb bay door opening for a split second, appearing as a fleeting blip. The gunners would spin the turret, depress the trigger, and unleash a stream of fire into the dark. They were fighting probability. And they were losing. The rounds arced into the sky, thousands of pounds of lead reaching the apex of their flight, stalling and falling back down onto the city. The Iraqis were shelling their own capital in a desperate bid to hit the Phantom. High above the tracer arcs, the bandit pilot checked his displays. He was approaching the initial point. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability, not because of radar, but because of physics. To drop the bomb, he had to open the bay doors. When the bomb bay doors of an F-117 open, the perfect faceted geometry is ruined. The internal cavity of the aircraft becomes a corner reflector, a massive radar trap. For approximately 3 seconds, the stealth jet lights up on radar screens like a Christmas tree. It is the death window. The pilot's finger hovered over the pickle switch. He watched the timer. The mission computer, archaic by modern standards, was calculating the wind drift, the airspeed, and the ballistics of the weapon. 3, 2, 1. Clunk. Whoosh. The bay doors snapped open. The trapeze launcher kicked the GBU-27 Paveway 3 out of the belly. The doors slammed shut. Total exposure time, 2.5 seconds. On the ground, a Soviet-made spoon rest radar operator might have seen a single terrifying blip appear and vanish. Was it a glitch? A bird? Before his brain could process the signal, the screen returned to the hypnotic emptiness of the all-clear. The GBU-27 was now a glider. It was a specialized weapon, a bunker buster, encased in a high-strength steel penetrator body. It was not designed to explode on contact. It was designed to survive the impact, punch through 6 feet of reinforced concrete, and detonate in the basement. The pilot banked the aircraft hard to the left. He was not leaving. He had to guide the bomb. The F-117 carried 2 sensors, the FLIR forward-looking infrared in the nose for navigation, and the DLIR, downward-looking infrared in the belly for targeting. As the plane banked, the system handed off the laser designator from the nose to the belly. Display, monochrome green. Crosshairs, locked. Target, Baghdad Telecommunications Center. The building was a fortress. The Iraqis knew it was a target. They had surrounded it with SAM sights. But they could not shoot what they could not see, and they could not jam a laser beam they did not know was painting the roof. The laser beam was a silent, invisible thread connecting the jet to the building. The bomb's seeker head, a robotic eye on a gimbal, flared its fins. It caught the reflection of the laser sparkle on the concrete roof. It made micro-adjustments. It was not falling. It was hunting. Inside the telecommunications center, the night shift was working. They felt safe. The walls were thick. The air defense outside was deafening. They believed the iron curtain of flak would protect them. They were relying on the 20th century concept of hard cover. But 21st century warfare does not knock. The bomb struck the ventilation shaft, a weak point identified by CIA blueprints. It did not explode. Not yet. The kinetic energy of the 2,000-pound dart drove it through the roof, through the 3rd floor, through the 2nd floor, and into the server room deep in the structure. The fuse on the GBU-27 is programmable. It counts the layers. Impact, delay, impact. Delay. It waits until it is buried in the heart of the structure before triggering the chemical reaction. Time, T-0.00. Event, detonation. The building did not just collapse, it inflated and then exhaled. The windows blew out simultaneously, showering the streets with glass. The shock wave turned the internal organs of the communications network, both electronic and human, into vapor. From the air, the pilot saw the screen flash white. Impact, he whispered. It was clinical. There was no shaking of the stick, no roar of the engine, just a silent flash on a small TV screen. The digital assassin had executed the warrant. On the ground, the confusion was absolute. The Iraqi commanders were stunned. The building was gone. The bunker was a crater. But the radar was still clear. "It is sabotage. It is a car bomb." There were no planes. They could not accept the reality. To admit that an airplane had flown directly over their heads, dropped a bomb down an elevator shaft, and flown away without being touched was to admit that their entire military doctrine was a lie. So they lied to themselves. They claimed it was SAS commandos. They claimed it was a Tomahawk cruise missile. But the rumors started to spread among the conscripts manning the guns. They whispered about the Al-Shabaab, the ghost, the plane that eats radar, the plane that flies through steel storms. The psychological impact was more devastating than the high explosives. The F-117s were stripping away the Iraqi army's will to fight. What is the point of manning a radar if the screen lies? What is the point of firing a cannon if the enemy is a ghost? The unfair fight had broken them. Back in the sky, the bandit pilot leveled off. He checked his fuel. He checked his remaining weapon. He had one more bomb, one more target. He was untouched. The paint on his fuselage was not even scratched. The analog fury of the Soviet-supplied defense network continued to rage below him, a frantic, impotent light show. The Iraqis were burning millions of dollars of ammunition into the empty sky, fighting a memory of a war that no longer existed. The pilot adjusted his trim. He brought up the next waypoint. He felt a strange, cold detachment. He was not a warrior in the Homeric sense. He was not clashing swords. He was an executioner. He was the administrator of a new reality. The Soviet advisors monitoring the situation from deep inside the USSR watched the reports coming in on the teletype machines. The data was impossible. Item: Sector 4 radar active. Item: Sector 4 headquarters destroyed. Item: No enemy track. They looked at the paper. They looked at each other. The old men in Moscow, the ones who believed in mass and iron, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Russian winter. They were watching the future. And they were not in it. The sky over Baghdad was no longer a battlefield. It was a laboratory. And the experiment was a success. Date: February 28, 1991. Status: ceasefire. Casualties: F-117 fleet, 0. The sun rose over a different world. The smoke that hung over Baghdad was not just the debris of burning ministries. It was the funeral pyre of a military doctrine that had stood since World War II. The arrogant titan was silent. The paper tiger had torn the throat out of the Soviet bear's proxy. When the dust settled and the accountants of war began their grim tally, the numbers were not just impressive, they were statistically impossible. The Iraqi military had fired more anti-aircraft rounds than were fired in the entirety of the Second World War. They had launched thousands of surface-to-air missiles. They had turned the sky into a solid wall of metal. And against the F-117 Nighthawk, the result was a mathematical 0. Sorties flown, 1271. Direct hits taken, 0. Aircraft lost to enemy fire, 0. The Ghost had flown through the heart of the most dense air defense network on the planet, night after night, with the impunity of a tourist. It was not a battle, it was a commute. The pilots did not just survive, they were bored. The force multiplier effect was absolute. In Vietnam, destroying a single bridge required dozens of F-4 Phantoms, tankers, jammers, and wild wheels, often with heavy losses. In Iraq, one F-117 with one bomb did the same job. The sledgehammer of mass had been replaced by the scalpel of precision. For the Soviet advisors watching the footage of precision strikes on CNN, the verdict was catastrophic. They realized that their entire inventory, the thousands of tanks, the miles of radar arrays, the silos of missiles, was instantly obsolete. They had built a military based on the assumption that they could see the enemy coming. We built a shield of steel. They built a dagger of glass. The shield is useless. The psychological impact rippled out from Baghdad to Moscow and eventually to Beijing. The era of air superiority where you fight for the sky was over. The era of air dominance had begun. Air dominance means you do not fight for the sky, you own it. You occupy it. It is your property, and the enemy lives only because you have not selected their grid square yet. The F-117 Nighthawk proved that the technological chasm was real. It proved that in the modern age, if you are relying on analog mass to fight digital ghosts, you are not a combatant. You are a target. The laugh from Section 1 had been replaced by a terrified silence. Innovation had not just defeated dogma, it had humiliated it. There is no luck. There is only superior physics. The Nighthawk would eventually be retired, replaced by the F-22 and the F-35, sleeker, faster predators. But the lesson it taught the world remains written in the blackened concrete of Baghdad bunkers. It taught us that the most dangerous weapon is not the one that makes the loudest noise. It is the one you never see coming. They built a wall to stop it. They never realized we would just fly over it. If you want to understand the engineering behind the impossible and the stories of the machines that broke the world, subscribe for more stories from the chasm.